So the way that I thought best of structuring this lecture was to actually go through the meandering path of my career to really kind of understand how space policy works in the context of the obligations that get placed on a country as a result of sort of international agreements and things like that. So I'll be focusing quite a bit on international obligations placed on the UK in various ways. And as I say, this will mostly be through the frame of my own career experience. So we're going to start with a brief history of SJ. So how does an exploration geologist end up working in the space industry? So as already been said, I'm from Namibia. I grew up in Windhoek. I used to work in offshore diamond mining on a ship called the Otoivo. I worked with a sort of a mining crew of about 20 men. I was the only woman on board for the first year of my time out at sea. But overall, there were about 80 men on board that ship, crewing the vessel overall. So it was with De Beers Marine Namibia that I did that job. And I did that for probably about a decade before moving to the UK. What I'm going to do as we go through is you'll see these grey boxes come up. And these grey boxes are kind of my takeaways from different experiences that I've had and how they kind of relate back to international relations in my view. So I'll kind of have these as we go through and then a little bit of a summary at the end. So things I learned from my time offshore. Here I worked with a really multinational team. There was different socioeconomic backgrounds. People came from speaking different languages. We had different nationalities represented. And one of the most important things there was finding common ground, because in this situation, I was in a position of authority and I was in my early 20s. And you can see from that picture, this is a big group of burly men. So kind of getting them to agree to things and take my opinion seriously was a challenge from the outset, but I feel like I got there in the end. But yeah, kind of finding common ground was one of the most important things, sort of teaching them about what I was doing, allowing them to kind of understand why I was asking them to do certain things, understanding how to do conflict resolution. So if there were problems that arose, really kind of understanding how those can be addressed. Listening was a really big one, and this is going to come up again and again. In order to sort of solve challenges and avoid conflicts and things like that, really kind of understanding the perspectives of the people involved was really important sort of for the mining sector and for my career as a geologist. And the other big thing here was about the big picture. As a geologist, obviously, I'm there to do a job, but everything I do has impacts on the company and has impacts on the crew. If I say we have to mine for a little bit longer in an area, it impacts the plant, and therefore it impacts a whole number of people within the crew. So kind of always being conscious of how my actions were impacting others and thinking about that sort of bigger view was a really key takeaway for me from this experience. And from that, I moved on to Birkbeck University, where I did my PhD, which I'm not going to go into now, but I will just talk a little bit about my postdoc. So as Etim said as well, this was with the Natural History Museum. And the task that we were given was to create a sample analog collection for the European Space Agency. And what does that really mean? Basically, it turns out that rocks in space are very similar to rocks on Earth. There are some key differences, but you know, if you want to be able to create a drill that you can use on Mars, you need to be able to test it on rocks that are really similar to what you might find on Mars. So kind of being able to build a collection of rocks and minerals that were as similar in terms of their physical and chemical properties was essentially the task that we were set. So with this, I managed to obviously gain a lot of experience in sample analogs. And analogs can be both the actual materials themselves, but it can also be locations. So here is a picture of a landscape in Iceland, which is often used by astronauts in training to simulate the environment of what it might be like on Mars. But I also got to go to quite a few conferences and things like that. So this started giving me a little bit of international exposure. I'll talk a little bit more about the European Space Agency in a second. But just to kind of quickly touch on a few of my learnings from this one. So one of the things I really learned here was delivering at pace. We had a very specific contract to fulfill. There were deliverables, there were timelines. We had resource constraints. So this is something you'll come up again and again, depending on where you work, is if you have limited time and limited resources, how do you make the most of what's in front of you and still achieve the objectives? So delivering at pace, working to tight deadlines, and really effective communication to make sure that you know who's doing what and when, so that you can achieve what you're trying to achieve. So then we go on to a little bit more information about the European Space Agency. So a question I get almost all the time is the European Space Agency part of the EU? And the answer to that is no. The European Space Agency predates the EU. So there are a number of agreements between the countries that form ESA, which predate the EU. A lot of ESA member states are now EU member states, but again, it is not an EU institution. The UK was one of the founding members of the European Space Agency. And the agency itself is based around a council with the Director General, who's assisted by staff. And it's also sort of framed around something called the ESA Convention. And that convention places obligations on all member states, of which there are 22 at the moment within ESA. So there are two types of programs within ESA. The first is the mandatory program. So that's primarily the space science program, but also some technology development programs. And that you have to pay into if you are a member of ESA. The second part is the optional programs. So those have specific implementing rules and declarations, which all member states have to adhere to if you subscribe to that program. So they have programs around things like Earth observation, human and robotic exploration, navigation. So you sort of choose the areas that you want to invest in based on your national ambitions and skills. So those are the optional programs. But essentially, this places obligations on the UK and on all ESA members to abide by the implementing rules and declarations, and also by the ESA Convention. So this is an example of something called public international law. I'll touch very briefly on the different types of international law without going into too much detail there. But the thing is, with membership of ESA, and things like the African Space Agency are similar, the idea here is pooling resources. So putting together your money, your people, sharing risks and achieving great things together, because particularly for the UK, it gives us access to missions which we would otherwise find unaffordable. So examples of that are things like the James Webb Space Telescope, where we were able to contribute an instrument. The James Webb Space Telescope endeavor on its own is nothing that any single nation could have afforded. So by sharing resources, money, people, time, and risk, you're able to achieve a lot more together. So I'm just going to go very, very, very briefly talk a little bit about international law. So there are two different types of international law. One is public and one is private. Public international law is things like the UN Charter, so any of the UN General Assembly resolutions which come out of the General Assembly. Things like international space treaties, so I'll touch a little bit on the Outer Space Treaty, the ITU Convention and Radio Regulation, so you'll hear about those as well over the coming days. And then the other part of that is private international law, so those are treaties between countries and things like collaboration agreements. So I'll talk a little bit about the Artemis Accords as we go through, but there are a number of examples of private international law as well. And I mention this because, again, these are the things that place international obligations on the UK. And that kind of sets the frame for some of the things we're going to talk about. So I love the Treaty on the Principles Governing the Activities of States and the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. So this is the UN Treaty. We abbreviate it to the UN Outer Space Treaty because it's a little bit shorter. The title is quite long there. And you can see I've kind of highlighted some of the key principles within the treaty itself. So, exclusively for peaceful purposes, free for exploration, shall avoid harmful contamination. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. And this was published, or this was issued in 1967. At the moment, there's 115 countries that are party to the treaty, and another 22 who have signed but not yet ratified the treaty. So 1967, when this kind of came into being, the world was a very different place. So I thought it might be interesting just to sort of take a little side detour and talk a little bit about kind of how we got to the space treaty. So 1955, the US announced that they were going to launch their first satellite. So this was a really big deal. Obviously, it made international news. But then in 1957, it was actually the Soviet Union who launched their first satellite and beat the US in that race. And that was Sputnik 1. And a few months later, or I think it might have even been a few weeks later, Sputnik 2 was launched. And that first satellite sent radio signals back to Earth for up to 3 weeks, which was just incredible at the time. But Sputnik ended up fueling a space race and an arms race. In addition to increasing Cold War tensions, these two countries just kept working at different ways to attack each other, both overtly and covertly. So then we go to 1958. NASA is officially formed. So this is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So I think most of us have heard of NASA. But the other thing that was formed in 1958 was the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, UNOOSA, who you probably have also come across in the past. In 1958, we get the first pictures of Earth from space, which also start transforming the way people think about our planet. The first landings on the moon take place as well, and that was by the USSR. We also have animals being sent and returned safely from space. And this just kind of sets everything alight when it comes to what's possible. But it also was coupled with those increasing Cold War tensions. So in 1963, we had the treaty banning nuclear weapons testing in space. And you'll see within the treaty itself that ended up being not placing nuclear weapons in space as well. In 1963, the precursor to the treaty was established and kind of agreed amongst member states, and that was the Declaration of the Legal Principles for Activities in Outer Space. And this was followed again by just incredible technological advances and events. So we had spacewalks for the first time. We had a mission to Mars. And in 1967, we also had the first tragedies, which took the lives of astronauts, both from America and from Russia. And then in 1967 as well, we had the Outer Space Treaty formally being put out there. And it is a multilateral treaty which really forms the basis of international space law. So if you are part of a country that is not party to the treaty, it's something that you'd want to think about quite hard, because it's essentially how we agree that we're going to act when it comes to space and the peaceful uses of outer space. So this brings me to another point, which is how do you actually enforce the treaty? So obviously public international law like this places obligations on all parties, but how do you make sure that people in your country adhere to what's in the treaty? So the way that you ensure that those obligations that are placed on a state can be translated to the domestic sector is through national legislation, essentially. So in the UK, we started this in 1986 with the Outer Space Act. This has been licensing space activity now for 3 decades. It's still in force at the moment, and we still rely on it. This was essentially to regulate activities carried out by UK entities overseas. So this wasn't looking at, we can launch from the UK. This is looking at us launching from different states. So it allows UK entities to launch and procure launch for a space object. And it also permits the operation of a satellite in orbit and other activities in outer space. So you get a license essentially under the Outer Space Act. That was followed in 2018 by the Space Industry Act. So the Space Industry Act was basically building on the Outer Space Act and saying, okay, well, what if activities are taking place within the UK? So your operators are based in the UK and then operating within the UK. So the Space Industry Act sets out a high-level framework for commercial spaceflight operations. It's designed to be very non-prescriptive and outcomes focused. So what does that actually mean in practice? So non-prescriptive means we're not telling you exactly how thick the metal needs to be on your launching rocket, or what type of fuel you have to use, or specific criteria that you have to meet in a prescriptive way. Like the aviation sector is very different in that way. There are lots of sort of very specific prescriptive requirements. When it comes to the way that we've chosen to do space law, a lot of it is centered around something called the safety case. And within that, an operator has to prove that the risks are as low as is reasonably practicable. That concept is known as ALARP. It's a little bit shorter to say, but it basically puts the onus on the operator to demonstrate safety. So you can use lots of different technologies to achieve safety. So that makes it a lot more sort of future-proof as well as a result. So it provides a very comprehensive regime for suborbital space activities. It also draws on existing space and aviation regulation. You'll see a lot of the principles in the treaty reflected in the Space Industry Act as well. And it sits alongside the Outer Space Act, which continues to apply to operators outside of the UK. And then we took that a step further. Apologies for the resolution of that picture. The space industry regulations were published in 2021, and that was in July. And at the same time as publishing those regulations, we established the independent regulator for space in the Civil Aviation Authority. So obviously they have a lot of expertise already within the aviation sector. So adding space was not a big reach there. And it provided them with the capability to license, monitor, and oversee launch, re-entry, spaceports, and range control activities in the UK. So back in the day, I formed part of the team which led the regulations through their final iterations. So that was preparing a lot of the guidance material. So within the regulations, that sort of sets out specifically what operators need to do, things, criteria they need to meet, that sort of thing. So we had to provide very detailed guidance on every part of the regulations to explain how things would work in practice. But then the other side of that was the fact that these regulations would need to go through Parliament, which was pretty scary for me. I had never done anything like that. So, making sure that we were working with ministers to ensure that they actually understood the regulations and that when they took them through Parliament, they could defend them appropriately as well. So there was a lot of kind of work around that as well. And we had a lot of sort of changes that were required once we went out to consultation, where we took the draft regulations and put them out to the sector and the world to comment on. We ended up making quite a few changes. So that was part of the work that I led as well. But getting back to my little action learning sets there, the things I took away from this and what I'd recommend if you are thinking about national space law is really kind of making sure that you have a multidisciplinary team involved in the development of the legislation. So we had legal experts from a range of different fields. We had technical experts as well. So if you're looking at, mandating something within the regulations, does that add cost? Does that add weight to a launcher, which is going to make it uneconomic in the future? Does it introduce a new type of paint that's actually technically causes damage when you reach the vacuum of space? There's all sorts of things that you don't necessarily consider when you're only focusing on the legal elements. So having technical experts is really helpful. And then also just bringing in different types of regulators. So the Civil Aviation Authority was obviously a really key part of developing these regulations. The regulations were owned by the Department for Transport. But we also involved regulators like the Health and Safety Executive as well, because they just had so much experience in dealing with safety and really kind of understanding how that works in practice. And then also bringing in different policy professionals. So we had the Environment Agency coming in to talk to us about different environmental considerations. Again, Department for Transport, the UK Space Agency. There were a number of other government departments that played a role here. And the other one was international partners. So was what we were proposing, how did it sit with others? How did it compare to what other countries had done? And was it kind of an approach that others would look to and maybe consider equivalent licensing, for example? That's something that we're exploring with a number of countries. So that's just a brief sort of foray into how you take things like treaties and take those obligations and then translate them into something that you can place on your own industry. So that was a really interesting and informative experience. A lot of it was during COVID as well, which was a bit mad. So getting that team together was quite challenging, but also quite rewarding because we could convene in a way that I think we probably wouldn't have been able to do if we were just doing things in person. So it all worked out in the end. So that brings me to, if we go from the treaty to sort of how we do that nationally, to the next step of that, which is the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Their main task is to review and foster international collaboration in the peaceful uses of outer space, as well as to consider legal issues arising from the exploration of outer space. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but that's what you'll find online about what the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space does. The abbreviation there is UN COPUOS, so I'll use that going forward. So COPUOS is supported by the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, UNOOSA, and the committee itself has two subcommittees, and those are the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and the Legal Subcommittee. And each of those subcommittees discuss different aspects of what it means to act in space. And they convene as part of a plenary, which happens after the two subcommittees have taken place. And essentially, it's all about promoting cooperation and peaceful uses of outer space. One of the key things here is that UNOOSA and the UN Committee, UN COPUOS, they act by consensus. So that in itself is quite challenging. So at the moment, there's 102 members. It's one of the largest committees of the UN. It also, in addition to states, has a number of international organizations, which both include intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. They have observer status within the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and the subcommittees. So you've got a lot of people in the room here. How do you get consensus? How do you agree anything? It's really difficult. But some of the things that I've learned from attending COPUOS and kind of being part of both the subcommittee meetings and the plenary is that a lot of the work happens outside of the meetings. So in the meeting itself, you'll see quite quickly which countries kind of agree with each other or are like-minded is the phrase that we use a lot. But you also get countries who will always disagree on certain elements that go against the principles that they hold. And so a lot of the work happens outside of the meeting, where you have discussions with states who may not agree with you to try and find compromise. And language is really important in that, because the compromise is always going to be around how you say something. And so that can be quite challenging. So patience is a real virtue here, because kind of having that, the time to have that conversation again and again is important. And so a key thing there is really understanding your objectives before you go. So what are the things that you're trying to achieve as a country, and how are you going to achieve those? Where are your red lines? Where are those areas where there's some flexibility for you to compromise, for you to agree to things that you might not normally automatically agree to? But having said that, you know, COPUOS is just a fantastic place to be able to exchange those views, to be able to talk to so many different countries about space, and to kind of be part of a multilateral approach to how we do things, to how we act. It's quite an incredible experience, and if you do ever get the chance, don't say no, go for it. It's just it's really awesome. And then, you know, one good thing leads to another. So as a result of kind of representing the UK in COPUOS, I also came across the European Space Policy Institute. We were members, I think, at the time as well. And so I ended up getting invited to the third interregional space policy dialogue between Asia Pacific and Europe. And this was specifically talking around the implementation of the long-term sustainability guidelines, which is something I'll go into a little bit more detail on. But the long-term sustainability guidelines, there's another example of something that was agreed by all COPUOS member states by consensus, but it took 10 years. It took 10 years to kind of get to that first set of agreed guidelines. And so how do you get from that to kind of the next step, which is the implementation? So this takes me into a nice segue into something on capacity building. But first, just a few kind of takeaways there. And that's take any and all opportunities to engage with new partners, listen and learn from others, and again, find common ground. I am still talking to a lot of the people in the room in that picture. And we've met in various different forums to discuss various things, and building those relationships and building trust is really important when it comes to space diplomacy and kind of international relations in action. But I wanted to just talk a little bit more about something called capacity building. You'll hear this phrase quite a lot. And it's essentially, how do you share knowledge and experience in a way that leaves the other partner richer and then able to kind of do things themselves? That's what it really comes down to. So it's, building capacity, essentially, building skills and expertise. So this is something that's quite important for the UK, whether we're sharing lessons learned on things like how we developed our regulations or our legislation, how we manage international programs. An exchange of knowledge shouldn't be a one-way street. We should be both sharing our experiences, but we should also be learning from others to kind of bring back knowledge that others have built up as well through their own experiences. And a way that we've kind of done this, and a good example of that is, again, work that we've done with the UN on the long-term sustainability guidelines. So it turns out that as a space agency, we could partner with UNUSA, and they would do things as part of projects together. So obviously it cost us money, it wasn't free, but they were an incredible delivery partner when it came to sort of some of the work that we did on the long-term sustainability guidelines. The first thing we did is we said, okay, capacity building, how do we get uptake? How do we get countries to actually try and implement the guidelines? We thought the first thing to do is actually make sure that the guidelines are accessible. So there are 6 official UN languages. So the first project that we did was actually getting the long-term sustainability guidelines published in all 6 official languages. So that already sort of opens up a huge number of countries to essentially being able to access the guidelines. And then the next thing is around implementation. So through a project that we did with UNUSA, they invited individual member states and organizations to complete case studies on the implementation and progress and lessons learned from the guidelines. And then we set up a website for the projects to be hosted. So essentially, case studies are a great way for capacity building and just sort of sharing information. So how did you implement something? What were the specific things that you had challenges with? And then another country might read that case study and go, oh, okay, so that's how we practically could take this thing written on a page and do something on the ground. So it was really quite powerful, sort of setting up those case studies. And then in the second phase of the work we did with UNUSA, they prepared a stakeholder study report, and that spoke to 37 states and 5 international intergovernmental organizations to talk again about the implementation of the guidelines. And they produced a report which was made available as an open access resource last year or the year before. And that was anonymized as well. So it's just kind of looking at those experiences and drawing out the lessons learned and having those be available to others. The other thing that we did with UNUSA was to deliver expert events. So this was like specific training sessions where different parts of the LTS guidelines were discussed, and also e-learning modules were created as well. And again, you can access those on the websites. There was another project as well, which was looking at the registration of space objects. So this is something that the UN requires, but a lot of countries aren't really sure how to do it in practice. So that expert event was really good for kind of sort of explaining, what that looks like in practice, how you do registration. So capacity building is kind of a big one for us. So if we go back to the thread of international obligations, where do things like capacity building fit in? Well, it's fundamental to the implementation of our international obligations, which stem from the Outer Space Treaty, particularly around things like the LTS guidelines. It's also important for wider UN initiatives. So I'm going to, again, focus on a specific example here of something I have experience around, and that's the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. So this is something that all states are trying to achieve. So the SDGs, you've probably come across them at some point in your life and in your career. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted by all United Nations members in 2015, and it created these 3 SDGs. And they're really about kind of creating the conditions for world peace and prosperity for people and the planet, while tackling climate change and working to preserve oceans and forests. We obviously took this pretty seriously, as did most countries, right? If you sign up to it, it means that you agree with the principles, and you're going to make every effort to try and achieve the objectives set out in the SDGs. And so for us, we kind of thought, okay, well, how can space play a role in this? And so a year after the SDGs were kind of announced in 2016, we initiated something called our International Partnerships Program, with the aim of helping us meet our international obligations around the SDGs to improve the lives of others. And in this case, really sort of focusing in on satellite technology and UK kind of expertise for that. So I'm going to read the blurb of what the IPP kind of frames itself around. So it used the UK's space sector's research and innovation strengths to deliver a sustainable economic or societal benefit to emerging markets. It sought to address the need for better access to high-quality information for addressing global sustainable development challenges, as a lack of timely, accurate, large-scale data and reliable communications infrastructure, especially in emerging markets, results in inaction or investments that do not deliver value for money where limited financial resources are available. So I think there's some like key things in there to draw out, and it's really kind of thinking about emerging markets and kind of really trying to be targeted in how you make interventions. So I'll come to this later again as well, but the worst thing you can do is think you know the answer. When you're working with another country, if you think you know what they need, you're already wrong. You have to have that dialogue. You really have to sort of make sure that the investments that you're making and the solutions that you're offering are actually fit for purpose for the country in question and their national objectives and what it is they're trying to achieve. Because you can't wedge every country into a solution. So, the IPP program was really focused on how data from satellites could help specifically address these sustainable development goals. So again, I'm going to have to apologize for the quality of this image as well. I will try and find a better resolution one soon on that one. But this is just a summary of the projects. And I think the stats speak for themselves there. This was an example of both where we funded commercial collaborative projects, but we were also meeting our international obligations around the sustainable development goals. So it's kind of looking at it from those two different perspectives. There was a lot of capacity building involved here as well. It wasn't just about providing the sort of money for a solution. So in the end, over the 6 years that we ran our pilot program, we managed to address 10 of the 17 SDGs by working with 47 countries on 43 distinct projects, the bulk of which were linked to disaster resilience and agriculture. But obviously we focused on quite a number of different areas as well. And in addition to working with countries to address the sustainable development goals through something like a funded program like the IPP or the International Partnerships Program, we're also quite engaged actively in areas like disaster response and recovery. So as part of my role when I was the head of international relations, I was also the board member to the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters. and I took us through the 6-month leadership period that we held last year. The leadership of the charter sort of rotates every 6 months, so we held it last year. So climate change is increasingly causing negative impacts on lives and livelihoods. Space and satellite data can make a real difference in mitigating the impacts of climate change, in particular when it comes to disaster response and recovery. So I'd like to introduce you guys to the International Charter, if you're not aware of it, but also talk about UN SPIDER. So I'm gonna speak out the acronym once, and then I'm gonna go back to calling it UN SPIDER because I always get this one wrong. So it's the United Nations Platform for Space-Based Information for Disaster Management and Emergency Response, UN SPIDER. There are lots of other ways that the UK Space Agency and the UK in general is working around disaster response and recovery. I'm not going to go through all of those. I'm going to stick to the ones that I kind of know the most about, and that's the International Charter and UN SPIDER. So if we just start with kind of, who's part of the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters. It's a worldwide collaboration through which satellite data are made available for the benefits of disaster management by combining Earth observation assets from 17 different space agencies, and you can see them on the map there. The Charter allows resources and expertise to be coordinated for rapid response to major disaster situations, thereby helping civil protection authorities and the international humanitarian community. This unique initiative is able to mobilize agencies around the world and benefit from their know-how and their satellites through a single access point that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and at no cost to the user. So that's a really key thing. Access to the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters is free of charge to the user. In the last year, I think it recorded 63 disasters where the charter was activated. On average, it's about 50 times a year. And it's hard to tell at the moment whether it's increasing or not, but we're on about 50 at the moment for this year. So between the members of the charter, so those 17 space agencies you see there, and a number of cooperating bodies, there are 270 satellites that the charter can call on to support emergency responses worldwide. That's a pretty big number. But also, this is just a wonderful example of international relations in action. So you'll see that China is a member, you'll see that Russia is a member, but you'll also see that the US and Canada and a number of European countries, the UAE, there's a lot of countries involved. And this is an example of where we can kind of leave geopolitics at the door and not really get into kind of wider diplomatic issues, because at the end of the day, we're there to save lives and livelihoods. And that's kind of the focus, is to make sure that emergency responders on the ground have the accurate information that they need in a timely way to make decisions that really kind of help people's lives and save property as well. So just very quickly, the types of disasters that are covered by the International Charter. So there's natural events like earthquakes, fires, floods. In the UK, floods are a particularly big one for us. So the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency are now an authorised user, and they activate the charter quite regularly for flooding. But then also human-made events, so oil spills, industrial accidents, these are all covered by the charter. Things that the charter cannot be activated for are things like war or armed conflicts. So if a dam gets bombed, for example, that would fall under the War Armed Conflict Activation Clause, but also for slow onset disasters like a drought. So if you can see a hurricane coming, you can activate the charter ahead of time so that it's ready. But if it's something like a drought, then it's a more difficult situation. So only authorized users can directly request access to the charter. And so authorized users are typically civil protection agencies, government relief organizations, and other authorities with a mandate related to disaster management. But you also have cooperating bodies who can activate the charters. So that's the United Nations and a group called Sentinel Asia, who activate the charter on behalf of a number of Asia-Pacific countries. So as of June, there are 94 authorized users in 83 countries, as well as the EU. And since 2012, we've promoted global access to the charter. which basically means that any disaster management authority can apply to become an authorized user. So it's pretty easy to access the Charter, all things considered. But if you have a look here at Africa, there's only a handful of countries that use the Disaster Charter. And yeah, there's a lot of grey there, which means that they are not using the Charter. But organizations like UN Spider, they've actually been quite active in getting other countries introduced to the Charter, and they will also activate the Charter on behalf of other countries. So if you just look at kind of the years between 2003 and 2022, UNUSO and UN Spider activated the Charter 113 times. So that's about 15% of all of the activations of the Charter that took place. So they play quite a vital role when it comes to making sure that people can benefit from the Charter, even if they're not members. So just a little bit more about UN Spider. So you'll see the top left there, those blue boxes. Those are the kind of the key things that UN Spider focus on. So they have a knowledge portal where they share information. They have sessions where they foster cooperation and strengthen capacity in countries, but they also provide technical advisory support. So essentially they're tasked with ensuring that all countries have access to and develop the capacity to use all types of space-based information. So it's around Earth observation, but it's also around global navigation and SATCOMs, but with a specific focus on the full disaster management cycle, from early warning through to the disaster itself and the recovery which comes after. UN Spider has been really critical in actively promoting the International Charter with the disaster management community, and it has carried out engagement with national disaster management agencies across the world, including in Africa, Latin America, and some Caribbean users as well. And more than 20 national disaster management agencies have submitted requests to become part of the Charter as authorized users as a result of the UN Spider's initiatives there. They are also the UN authorized user for the activation of the Copernicus Emergency Management Service. So that's the bits in orange there on the left-hand side. So there's an on-demand mapping service, an early warning and monitoring service, and an exposure mapping service. So Copernicus is generally only reserved for EU member states, third countries, and cooperating states. But UN Spider is also able to access it. So I mentioned this as well because while you might not have access or might not have knowledge of the Charter, hopefully you have knowledge of UN Spider, and that can be a good route into the Charter if you have established links there already. So we just go to kind of, a little bit of learning from the last few slides. Things like the Sustainable Development Goals are a really good thing to galvanize around. It's something that we share across the globe. It's an objective that we've all kind of signed up to. And so as a point of focus for collaboration with other countries, it's a really good thing to sort of have front and center. Countries can benefit from wider international collaborations through existing bodies like UN Spider and the Charter. So what I'm trying to say there is essentially, you don't have to go country X or country Y, let's have an MOU together. Let's work together on something. You might already be in touch with that country just through the fact that you're both Charter users, or you're both, familiar with UN Spider. So, looking at existing international bodies that you are part of can open up a whole network of countries that you are already like-minded partners with, because you're part of these wider organizations. UN Copious is a great example of that as well. And the other thing here is collaboration doesn't have to cost money. Capacity building, space diplomacy, these are really valid and really good opportunities to build partnerships and learn from each other. And you don't have to actually spend any money. So I think, those are kind of my key takeaways from those organizations. And then I'm going to just touch a little bit on space diplomacy. So over the last decade, the UK Space Agency has initiated over 1,000 international science partnerships. It's a large number. I suppose it's over 10 years, so but still, it's over 1,000 international science partnerships across more than 80 countries. And our researchers have featured in over 3,500 science publications. And the way that we kind of get there is through space diplomacy, and it's finding opportunities to safely and sustainably explore the universe through partnerships. So I'm just going to talk about a few kind of examples of partnerships and things that might be of interest to this group. So the first thing I'm going to touch on are the Artemis Accords. So they're an example of kind of space diplomacy in action. And basically, to enable our own industry in the UK and our research communities to get involved in the Artemis mission, we signed the Artemis Accords. We were one of the original signatories to that. So what are the Artemis Accords? They are a multilateral agreement between NASA and any state which wants to participate in the Artemis mission to put boots on the moon by 2026. Essentially, what the US are after with this is that individual countries commit to shared principles for cooperation in the exploration and uses of outer space. So what does that mean in practice? Essentially, if you look at the Artemis Accords, you can download them. It's a series of principles, and all you're doing is agreeing to the fact that you agree with NASA's interpretation of elements that essentially come out of the outer space treaties. So there's things in there on emergency assistance, so emergency assistance for astronauts, for example, things on the registration of space objects, the release and sharing of scientific data, which comes from exploration of the moon, human heritage, space resources, debris and spacecraft disposal. These are all things that are kind of touched on already within the context of the outer space treaty. So NASA are essentially asking you to agree that their interpretation is your interpretation. So it's quite an interesting experiment because it's multilateral, but it's outside of the UN. So that's something that some nations have found a bit tricky. But I think the idea is that the principles will eventually kind of be incorporated into a wider multilateral process within UN COPUOS. How that works in practice is anyone's guess. So as of June, there were 43 countries which are signed up to the Accords, and they come from kind of all over, including 3 in Africa, 8 in Asia, 21 in Europe. So all different parts of the world. And all of this is about getting us further down the road to agreeing a shared international vision to facilitate human activity on the moon and eventually onto Mars, because the Artemis program is really looking at that. It's kind of the moon as a gateway to Mars, as a stepping stone. But NASA's not the only game in town. China and Russia's International Lunar Research Station, so the ILRS, is targeting similar timeframes and ambitions to NASA. So far, they have 12 countries and over 40 institutions from around the world have signed up to take part in developing the space. Their objectives are similar: to establish a comprehensive scientific experimental base on the lunar surface. And while there's no requirement for participants to sign up to agreed principles in the same way that Artemis is, the international consortium is expected to play a role in defining objectives, areas of collaboration, but most importantly, they'll also be involved in developing the legal documents which regulate relations. So there will be some kind of requirement around what it means to participate. But it's a pretty ambitious project, the ILRS. It's looking at having a facility built by 2035 in the lunar South Pole, with the second phase aiming to establish a network connecting the moon's South Pole, the equator, and the far side of the moon by 2050. So this is pretty ambitious, you know. But you know, if you are a country that wants to get involved in lunar exploration, you know, these are kind of some really key international opportunities to do so. But just getting back to kind of the UK's international obligations and kind of what are the things that we we do and how we position ourselves when it comes to international relations. I'm just going to talk a little bit about launch, because that's obviously something that's quite important to the UK. And I'll start by talking about the missile technology control regime. So this is an example of international cooperation. And some of the things that you sign up to or you agree to are about being part of a like-minded grouping of people who, or countries that feel the same way that you do about something. Some of it is around posturing, so you're demonstrating to people outside of the club as well that these are your views, and if you want to work with us, these are the things you have to agree to as well. And so the MTCR, or the Missile Technology Control Regime, is kind of one of those things. And for us, having or developing launcher capabilities, being part of the MTCR is quite important. So I'm just going to talk about it briefly here, and then a little bit about the Hague Code of Conduct. So the MTCR is a non-treaty arrangement of 29 states, which seek to prevent the proliferation of missile systems capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction through export controls on complete missiles, as well as the materials and components and technology used in missile systems. So you can imagine a lot of that like cuts across launches, right? So, you know, what is a space rocket if not a missile, essentially? And could it be capable of carrying weapons? Of course it could be. It could be capable of carrying anything. So again, you know, this has a very strong implication for us. It looks at missiles with a range of over 300 kilometers. So again, clearly, you know, launching rockets is in scope for that. And the guidelines in the annex form the basis of a case-by-case decision on exports by member states. So we kind of all decide together. And in the absence of an international treaty, which sort of stipulates norms around missile proliferation, it also acts as a coordinator for broader measures to tackle missile proliferation. So that's essentially countries agreeing on steps that they'll take and actions that they'll take around the development of missiles and their export. So essentially, you know, what we've done with this as well is used it to create export laws around movement of missiles and their components in and out of the UK. So that was quite a big one. But then another step that we've taken to join like-minded nations who are wanting to launch responsibly and transparently is to sign up to the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation. So we just call it the Hague Code of Conduct because that's a little bit shorter. And essentially, it's the result of efforts of the international community to regulate the area of ballistic missiles capable of carrying weapons of mass destruction. So it's similar to MTCR and it builds on that. But essentially, there's three kind of main things that you have to do to adhere to this code of conduct. And that is provide pre-launch notifications of any intended space launches, and then provide an annual declaration of the launches which actually took place, because there's one thing to say, these are the launches I'm going to do. Then you have to say, these are the launches I actually did. And then as part of kind of confidence building measures, you are also asked to invite international observers to launch sites. So this is, again, just ways of being transparent in how you launch and what you launch. So we're almost getting to the end here, not long to go. The last thing I kind of wanted to talk about is one of the things that I think is probably one of the best examples of international cooperation, and that's the International Space Station. So it's a multi-nation construction project, which is still the largest single structure humans ever put into space, which is just mind-boggling. So I've got a series of pictures up there. The first is top left is 1998. That was the first segment of the ISS that launched. 1998, that's crazy. It feels like the ISS has kind of always been with us, but yeah, in 4 years' time, it'll be 20 years of the ISS. It's just mad. So that's the top left. Top right is about a month later. That was the first module that got launched as well. If we go to the bottom left, that's in 2000. We had the first crew to reside in the station. So that was 2 Russians and an American. And then if you look on the right there, that was the picture taken of the ISS to celebrate the 10-year anniversary in 2010. So, I mean, obviously this is the largest space station that was ever built. It took 10 years to assemble, and it's maintained in low Earth orbit by a collaboration of 5 space agencies and their contractors. So your 5 space agencies here are NASA, Roscosmos, the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency. And it really is just a result of unprecedented scientific and engineering collaboration. It's just mad. And the space station, it's approximately the size of a football field. It's 4 times as large as the Russian space station, which was built a little while ago. So that's Mir, and 5 times as large as the US Skylab. It's 460 tons, so that's pretty heavy. And it's about 400 kilometers from the Earth's surface and traveling at speeds of roughly 30,000 kilometers an hour. But I think, you know, one of the key things here is here you have collaboration between 2 countries who were clearly at odds with each other. If we go back to the production of the 1967 Treaty on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, that was born from an animosity between Russia and the US or the Soviet Union. And, you know, to get to the stage where they co-own and cohabitate something like the International Space Station is just, it really is a wonderful example of how space has that ability to kind of transcend geopolitics and really kind of reflect the best of humanity. The most common form of collaboration is through scientific research. Having research experiments flown by ESA, NASA, or JAXA, all of these kind of improve our understanding of how living and working in space impacts the human body. And if you think of astronauts and kind of what they do in their day-to-day lives on the space station, it is really research for humanity. It benefits all of us. All that research comes back to the world, really, to access and do things with. So it's quite something. There have been more than 3,000 experiments conducted aboard the ISS to date, and they've really helped to sort of provide insights and improve life back on Earth, and also allow us to explore further into the solar system because of what we learn. But yeah, just again, a great example of the power of space to sort of transcend politics. I think just reflecting as well, you know, one of the things that astronauts always talk about is the overview effect. You know, there are no borders from space. And it's really difficult because obviously as nations, we have our own ambitions. We have really strong sort of identities and things like that. But at the same time, this idea that, you know, when you're up there and you're looking down, that those national kind of borders mean less, and you see humanity as a single organism. It's quite cool. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. Just to get to kind of the last bit of this talk, I wanted to just go through some of the takeaways from my perspective, and kind of what are the key ingredients as I see them for international collaboration. And again, this is kind of the world according to SJ. So you'll hear different things from different people over the course of this week. So it's up to you kind of what kind of sticks and what resonates with you. So for me, the key ingredients for kind of successful international collaboration is starting with your national context. So having a clear understanding of the challenges that need to be addressed, where there are market opportunities, for example, within the sector, what your national strengths are and capabilities. Without a sound understanding of your national capabilities and what objectives you're trying to achieve, knowing where the gaps are is really difficult. And then partnering or choosing partners to help you fill those gaps becomes more challenging as well. So a key thing is always to really start with your national context and sort of getting a keen understanding of what that is. As you've seen a few times today, listening and learning, that's a really important when it comes to potential partners value. we sometimes hear what we want to hear. So I cannot kind of say it enough. We bring in diverse voices from different organizations, different government departments, whatever, just really making sure that you've thought things through, and that you're really kind of listening and engaging with partners, either the partners that you want to engage, but also what your sector is telling you, what businesses are saying, what educators are saying they need or they expect from you as well, and really just making sure that that's front and center. And again, remembering that collaboration is a two-way street. It's not just about taking money or, capacity building efforts because they've been offered. It really needs to be about, what can you gain in the context of your national context, and have you really understood what's on offer and what it means, and just going back to that whole thing of learning being a two-way street. Yeah. The other thing here is common ground. So again, I've said this quite a few times. And for me, I think this is probably one of the most important parts of international collaboration, because even with partners where relations are strained in other areas, finding common ground is still possible and really important. And I think, the International Charter is a great example of that. So finding common ground with countries where we disagree quite regularly on a number of issues, we're still able to find areas where we can agree on what's important. And that is a bit of an art form, finding common ground, but it unlocks a lot of opportunity when you find it. Some countries it's a lot easier, particularly neighbors and countries that have similar sort of cultures or language, and things like that. But finding common ground is really important to sort of building momentum and building relationships. Also, joining international forums can really help with that. So things like the European Space Policy Institute, if they're having any events that might be of interest, if there are free courses you can sign up to, getting an opportunity to attend the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. These are all ways that you can find common ground with others. Another key ingredient is just thinking about the fact that collaboration doesn't always have to be about money, that there are financial and non-financial ways to collaborate. So examples like the Disaster Charter and UN Spider, all of these organizations offer free capacity building and training. Being a member of UN COPUOS is free, and it gives you access to a massive international community which is trying to understand the best ways to ensure the peaceful uses of outer space through dialogue and debate. So there are a lot of ways to build relationships that don't cost anything. And it can also be that even where it looks like something might cost money, so for example, collaborations that we've run recently, not all countries were able to match the amount of money that we put into projects, but they were able to offer what we call in-kind contributions. So that could be access to facilities, laboratories, people, resources. So it doesn't always have to be about matching money with money. It can be finding ways through partnerships which see an in-kind contribution. And that also opens up opportunities where things are quite constrained. Frameworks. So understanding your national ambitions will help to identify where it might make sense to align to international treaties, for example, like the Outer Space Treaty or things like the Missile Technology Control Regime, but also sort of ensuring that you have any legal frameworks from a national perspective that might be needed. So things like the Artemis Accords, for example, we've all signed up to those principles, and there are a number of workshops taking place. They started last year, where we're looking at the implementation and creating a framework around that, which kind of says, okay, this is what the principle says, what does it mean in practice? So really having a clear understanding of the frameworks that you're working within can really help to sort of set that international context. And allow for easier collaboration, because again, once you have your frameworks, you can find common ground in new ways. And for me, this is all a virtuous cycle, right? So, the more you do, the more you gain. And kind of yeah, how do you define a virtuous cycle? It's a chain of events in which one desirable occurrence leads to another, which further promotes the first occurrence, and so on, resulting in a continuous process of improvement. So I think, yeah, there's a lot to be said for international relations and kind of the international community. Building relationships is a starting point, and collaboration is what comes from that. But relationships for relationships' sake as well is probably something I should have included in here as well. But all of these elements that I've put in this slide will help you to build relationships with different countries and different individuals, which will ultimately help when it comes to identifying opportunities to collaborate and also kind of understanding what the terms of that collaboration might look like. And I think that brings me to the end. So